In a second, start sharing my screen, hoping you can see it all right.
Yes.
Okay, so as per the introduction, I am a science journalist and currently working for Nature Italy in particular, not Nature, for which I have contributed many years, mostly as a correspondent from Italy, but currently editing a regional edition of Nature dedicated to Italy. And as a science journalist, as for most science journalists, my attention over the last almost 2 years now has been kind of monopolized by the COVID-19 crisis. So although I also have some experience in covering risks or even in communicating risks from the institutional side on other types of risks, including natural and man-made disasters, I thought to focus this presentation on the COVID-19 crisis, because in addition to many things that have made this period unique, the COVID-19 crisis really has been a long experiment on risk communication, unprecedented in many ways. Actually, you can say that it has been many different experiments, because along the different phases of the pandemics, we have actually witnessed the transition towards different styles and needs of risk communication, going from the purely crisis emergency mode during the initial phase when most of the characteristics of the pandemic were unknown, into the next phases when the crisis kind of chronicized and also the rules of risk communications changed. But so I wanted to look a bit into the lessons that we have learned during these months and how they can be transported also to other areas of risk communication. First, a few words on what made this pandemic so special in terms of risk communication, what factors kind of made it a perfect storm for risk communication, with a combination of factors that made the challenge of communicating risks during this period so unique and so challenging for policymakers, for journalists, for professional communicators inside the institutions, for scientists, for everyone. First, we had a problem of a global risk, a pandemic, by very definition, a global risk that was mostly managed through national policies. So we always, and also risk communication was very much conducted at the national level through national policies by national choices. And this sometimes resulted into conflicting choices. It turned out to be an unpredictably long crisis, literally. I mean, we kept, if you think about it, for almost 2 years now, we've kept projecting the end of the crisis soon, and probably most of us 1 year ago, if we were told that at this stage, at this date, we would still be, wondering whether we will be able to travel freely for Christmas, it would have sounded far-fetched. So the duration of the crisis has been, from the very beginning, really difficult to predict and to factor in. There has always been, especially in the very early phases, but throughout the crisis, a huge level of scientific uncertainty around the actual dimensions of the risk. The crisis had heavy geopolitical implications because of the origin of the pandemic in China, the conflict, the level of conflict between states that appeared during the pandemic due to the impact of the travel restriction, to the impact on trade, to the back and forth accusation between countries of lack of transparency, etc. And there was also quite evident from the beginning a certain level of conflict between different risks. The health risk from the disease itself, of course, but also the risk to the welfare of the population posed by the measures themselves to contain the risk. And at some point, it became evident to everyone that communicating both kinds of risks and finding a balance between them was to be one of the main challenges. Also, one can look for some specific traits of the COVID-19 risk that allow to compare it to other risks that have been studied and that are known in the literature, also in the literature about risk communication. And from this slide on, I will, in several points of my presentation, quote quite heavily from an article that came out this year in the Journal of Risk Research, and you find the full reference at the bottom of this slide, and it's called "The Risk Communication and COVID-19 in Europe, Lessons for Future Public Health Crisis." But I think one could take health out of the title, because the lessons are really for crisis in general. And it is based on a comparison of the COVID-19 policies in 5 European countries: UK, Germany, France, Switzerland, and Sweden. And that is why you will find quite a bit of examples from this country in the countries in the rest of the presentation. So some key characteristics of the COVID-19 risk. One important risk dimension we know from the risk communication literature is whether risks are perceived as controllable by voluntary actions by the individual. Because we know that people tend to have a more optimistic view of risks that they perceive as controllable by their own will, whether that is actually true or not. So, for example, people tend to underestimate the risk posed by smoke or by obesity, because they are perceived as risk that they can be controlled by their own will. While on the other hand, the risks such as those posed by genetic modified organisms, I mean, whatever you can think about them, but at least on the health level, or on natural disasters, those are perceived as not controllable by the individual, and so they can be overestimated. In this sense, COVID has some contradictory aspects, because on some level, especially in the first phase of the pandemic, because the unknown nature, it was very much perceived as a non-controllable risks. Then, when the characteristics of the spreading of the infection became clear, there were also in some parts of the population some aspects of underestimation of the risk, because a feeling that the appropriate behaviors could help control it set in. We know people tend to have a more pessimistic perception of risks that have a catastrophic potentials, risks that can cause a higher number of fatalities in single event or in a shorter period of time, like aviation accidents as compared to road accidents. That's a classic example of risks that are where the latter is much more significant in terms of absolute numbers, but tends to be underestimated by people. And in this sense, COVID-19, especially again in the first phase, was clearly perceived with the risk with a catastrophic potential, and there were also psychometric experiments confirming this perception. People also worry less about hazards that are less visible, and this is clearly the case of an infectious disease, in particular one such as this one that can transmit between asymptomatic people, which was an extremely peculiar characteristic of this crisis. And a low level of scientific clarity about the nature, the dimension of the risk and its possible future evolution also adds to the risk perception. And in this case, we've been really battling with a lot of scientific uncertainty throughout the course of the crisis. A final concept that I would like to introduce and that has been used in relation to COVID-19, but that could very well become a permanent feature of major risks in the current information ecosystem, is that of an infodemic. The quotes that you find in this slide come from a paper that is actually still under embargo, as we journalists say, that is still in press as of today. It will be published later during this week in the Cell journal about the infodemic that was connected to COVID-19. And the term infodemic has been used for quite some time in the risk communication literature and in the information literature, initially to refer to the amplification effect of the news about the progenitor to COVID, the SARS, the severe respiratory syndrome from 2003. Then later it was mostly attached to the element of misinformation spreading rapidly through social media. But currently most researchers who focus on how information is contributing to the perception of risks, and in particular to the COVID-19 crisis, focused on a more general definition that defines infodemic as an overabundance of information, whether accurate or not, that can occur during an epidemic. And so, surely it has occurred in this case, simply a too big amount of information for people to process and to digest and to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information. I'd like to touch very briefly on what is risk communication. And I would just wanted to quickly quote the official definition that you find on the website, on the literature of the World Health Organization, because I think it is a quite appropriate definition. And it is nice that it uses some terms that are bidirectional and not just top-down or monodirectional. The WHO defines risk communication as the real-time exchange of information, advice, and opinion between experts or officials and people who face a threat to their survival. So not just from officials and from scientists to the general public, but the exchange of information that goes in two ways. And its ultimate purpose is that everyone at risk is able to take informed decisions to mitigate the effects of the threat. So before aiming to determine behavior in people, the goal of risk communication should be to make everyone able to take informed decisions. That may sound obvious on some level, but it is not always obvious in the practice of risk communication. Now, again, quoting from the paper in the Journal of Risk Research that I was referring to earlier, there are a few specific topics on which the analysis of those authors focus to try to compare the approach that was taken in different countries to the risk communication of COVID-19. One first dimension that is very important is who speak, whose voice was selected to be the main voice speaking to the people during the crisis. And here we saw relatively different examples across countries. In the UK, the choice was to base the communication around typically events, press conferences with one minister, or very often the prime minister himself, surrounded by one or two consultants, one or two scientific experts. That one with Boris Johnson at the center was a typical setting of the communication in the UK. In Germany, for some time, Angela Merkel, also thanks to her own scientific background, kind of filled both roles and was really the center of the country's communication on the crisis, although it was always made very clear to the public that decisions were informed by the scientific advice of the Robert Koch Institute. In Switzerland, the communication was really very much focused on two people that were basically the voice of the crisis for all Swiss people, who were a member of the Federal Council, Alain Berset, who acts like a sort of health minister, and basically the chief scientific advisor, the head of the main scientific body in charge of scientific accountancy, Daniel Koch. And in the US, as we know, this is my own addition because it is not included in the paper, the analysis of the US, but as we know, we also had a communication that was very much focused on one political figure and one scientific figure, meaning the then President Donald Trump and Anthony Fauci, but with very often a very visible disconnect between them two, sometimes actually literally visible in the body language during the events. I want to say a couple of words about Italy, although that is not included in the analysis in that paper, also because it is the country where I come from, and so is an example that as an Italian citizen I followed quite a bit. Now, although I have to say that, you know, one can make many different considerations, but I think that being the first country hit so hard by the pandemic with so much unknown at the time, overall Italy has displayed a fairly good handling of the pandemic as a whole. But in terms of risk communications, there were surely phases when the choice made to have very different, several different institutions communicating, from a scientific technical committee set up by the civil protection, the health minister himself, the higher council for health, which is yet another scientific body, special scientific consultants to the government, and then the whole local level, with the regions having their own health policies and their own press conferences and communication. This multiplicity of faces in key passages of the crisis resulted in confusion for the public. As an Italian living in Switzerland, because I currently live in Switzerland, I could not help but notice the striking difference between how the Swiss public only knew two faces, the one I've shown before, and all institutional communication on the pandemic passed those through those two voices, and the multiplicity of voices in the Italian scenario. And to that, one has to add the fact that that has to be credited in part to the choices made by the media industry in Italy to interview and to look for as many scientific voices as possible to diversify their coverage. But to that, one has to add all the interviews and opinions that, on top of the institutional communication, were given by scientific experts from universities, research centers, etc. That really created a situation that Italian readers may remember was at some point mocked satirically by social media users and by newspapers themselves, although they kind of created this situation very often. This was like a mock-up of a trading cards album, where instead of the football players, which is what you normally would have, and that is a popular tradition in Italy, where you have trading cards of virologists, because there were so many giving opinion in the media that at some point it seemed like the audience could just choose the scientific advisors and experts that gave the recommendations that were simply closer to the desire of the individual. So this resulted in some confusion in the Italian communication. In general, I think one can say that we experienced in many countries a trajectory from a honeymoon phase where scientific experts were sometimes turned into kind of rock stars and at some points literally idolized. But we also experienced how fragile this unexpected and new popularity of scientific experts was. And here in the pictures, you have the examples of the Swedish main scientific expert, Andres Tegnell, who at some point early on in the pandemic became, as you may remember, the poster face of the Swedish approach to the pandemic, with a very high level of popularity, of personal popularity, and of personal visibility for him in the very first phase. And then when some cracks began to show in the Swedish model, a very quick fall from grace, and in fact also explicit actions from the Swedish government to kind of reclaim communication, risk communication on the political figures rather than on him. And the other, of course, is the very well-known case of Anthony Fauci, who was really at some point idolized by a part of the American public as the sober and the responsible face of risk communication and pandemic. But then also, let's say, his popularity at some point started to have some cracks, and overall, let's say that some limitations of this model of risk communication, very much focused on the personality of the scientist, became evident at some point. So a few, going on with the lessons that we have learned in terms of the role of both political figures and experts, it has been it has become quite evident that an absolutely necessary requisite is to be able to lead by example. In the UK, for example, when both the political figure, Dominic Cummings, a member of Boris Johnson's cabinet, and the scientific figure as Niall Ferguson, a noted epidemiologist, when news came out that they had personally violated the COVID-19 restrictions to visit family members during the lockdown, that had a very heavy impact on the level of public trust and on the level of compliance in the public, as measured through several surveys in the UK. So leading by example is absolutely fundamental. Consistency among messages is also extremely important. Again, in the UK, some studies have measured that the rules on COVID-19 as communicated to the UK public has changed about 60 times between the onset of the pandemic and January 2021. And that has been shown to complicate a lot compliance and the level of trust in the government. And in fact, SAGE, the main advisory body to the UK government, has advocated at some point for a total reset of the communication on COVID-19 in November. But despite that, these inconsistencies and continuous change have continued beyond that. And again, while stressing that, of course, it was a very difficult situation, it was a very difficult job to communicate in that moment, and there was so much uncertainty about it. But one has to note that Italy, as the first country hit by the pandemic, was in the first phase is particularly inconsistent. That one is an image that the Italian public knows very well, of one of Italy's political leaders, the then leader of the Democratic Party, prominently having an aperitif in Milan in late February, early March 2020 to signal that the city was still open and the life had to go on as usual. And then, of course, about 2 weeks later, the whole country entered into lockdown. So those rush to take absolute positions towards no risk at all or highest risk didn't really help. Perhaps the most striking and most damaging example of what several levels of inconsistency can do and the damage they can do in terms of risk communication was the AstraZeneca mess, where a lot of wrong things happened when the AstraZeneca vaccine was temporarily halted in the spring of 2021, but on the right hand of my slide, you have a fragment of a Financial Times article that at the time described how a lack of communication and a series of U-turns between individual government, the relationships between governments, in particular the German one, and its own scientific advisors, and then a lack of coordination between various national governments resulted in a situation that was extremely difficult for the public to understand. But I would say on top of that all, after saying for months on basically everything that concerned the drugs and vaccines, that everyone would wait what the European Medicine Agency would say. That was the refrain and the talking point used for vaccine approval throughout the months. In that occasion, we had the paradoxical situation of the European Medicine Agency that kept saying the vaccine is safe, benefits outweigh risks, there is no reason to suspend it, and individual governments taking the opposite decision. And that inconsistency between the institutions and between what most institutions had said up to that point, let's just listen to EMA and do what they say, and what was happening, did the permanent damage to the vaccination campaign. It is the opinion of many. Now, a few technicalities. These are simpler points, but the pandemic has also taught us a bit of very simple lessons of the communication techniques that work best or work a little less good. Message clarity in a crisis is, of course, extremely important, down to the very words used. And in fact, one can see that in the two phases, in the transition between two slogans that happened in the UK communication. The first phase was characterized by a slogan and an accompanying visual that was very much appreciated by the UK public, as many polls have shown, and that is documented in that paper in the Journal of Risk Research that I'm quoting from. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. It very simply gives a quiet instruction on what people should do, and a quiet explanation of the rationale to do it. Later, when restrictions were partially eased, it was replaced by a variation on a theme: stay alert, control the virus, and save lives. That was instead much less appreciated, and in fact mocked quite a lot on social media by the British public, because of the, let's say, much lower level of clarity and much higher level of ambiguity that is in the message, because stay alert can mean a lot of different things. It is not a clear suggestion for the behavior. And also the visual language even itself, losing the difference in colors, etc., was much less effective. Sorry, I think I have swapped the two slides. I just want to go quickly with this one, and then I'll go back to the previous one. Also, this may sound very obvious, but another lesson that we were reminded of is of how visual formats and very effective and clear formats such as color codes can be helpful in summarizing complex indicators and help people cope with complicated messages and with complicated instructions. France was in fact basically the first country in Europe to adopt a color-based maps to highlight different risk levels across its areas and across different areas of the countries. Then this model was adopted by most other countries, and it has proven extremely helpful in guiding people towards navigating the variations of recommendations and restrictions throughout the countries and throughout different periods. I want to then refer to what is possibly the most important topic, probably the most crucial that has emerged through the pandemic. That is the difficulty of communicating uncertainty. It is often assumed by scientists and policymakers, and it has also happened during this pandemic, that recognizing uncertainty could have negative consequences, signaling lack of competence, eroding trust, maybe encouraging panic and fear. But what we've seen through those experiences, through those inconsistencies early on, and also through cases such as the AstraZeneca experience, is that showing certainty and then being proven wrong is surely worse. One example again can come from Switzerland, where at some point the results of a model, basically of prediction model that projected ICU beds in the country to run out in a few weeks, and that was presented with too much certainty as a firm prediction, and was then did not come true, but actually it came true only with a few weeks of delay, with a few weeks of lag, backfired in terms of public trust and of public perception very much. And it took time for the government to recover for all that.
Nicola, excuse me.
Yeah.
Nicola, excuse me. May I ask you to try to conclude as soon as possible, please?
Okay, I'll go towards the conclusion. I wanted to say a few things about how different framings of the communications campaign can influence perception. And I will just say quickly that experiences with the TV advertising, for example, of a social media campaign, have shown that messages based on fear and guilt are much less effective than ones based on solidarity, for example. Avoiding an us versus them mindset should be very much a focus of risk communications in this situation. I will just quickly say, these are all data that you find in that paper, so I will just quickly say that in all the 5 countries considered by that paper, France, Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, and UK, public trust has consistently been eroded throughout the pandemic. So that is as measured by surveys. And so that is overall a negative element that has to be considered and has to be factored in for the future, because at the end of the day, public trust is the basis for successful risk communication. There is one notable example, counter example at the international level that is worth looking into a little bit. That is New Zealand. New Zealand has had overall quite an amazing success, at least in the first phase, in the first year, in controlling the pandemic, and the level of public trust in the government and the Prime Minister in particular has been, with respect to other countries, sky high. And that has been attributed in part to the communication style of the Prime Ministers that has been extremely different from that of other countries. I will just say that although in the last months, the approval of the New Zealand Prime Minister has declined, it still remains higher than in many other countries. But it is interesting that it started to decline when Jacinda Ardern began to visibly disconnect from scientific advice and to take decisions that were partly criticized by her own scientific advisor, signaling that maybe, once again, inconsistency in one's approach is definitely damaging to public trust. A few recommendations. I will go very quick. I have a final slide that summarizes them all, so I can just use this final slide to conclude and to give a few lessons learned. These are a mix of the lessons learned as described in the paper from the Journal of Risk Communications and from further elaborations from myself on the examples that I've shown. We have learned that ensuring communication is consistent over time and avoiding U-turns is extremely important in order to achieve effective risk communications. Instructions should be clear and actionable to ensure public compliance. Leading by example and solidarity should be embedded in any risk communication strategy. Fear and guilt-based frames where the public, instead of decision makers, are blamed for the negative effects of the crisis are a no-go, are really not particularly effective in terms of risk communication. Bottom-up communication styles, such as that pioneered in New Zealand, rather than purely top-down communication, is definitely better. All communication campaigns should be pre-tested beforehand, preparing different scenarios and evaluate them before a crisis. The better model seems to be one where risk communications is informed by experts, but is actually led by elected officials, instead of making experts themselves the rock stars of science communication. And in bold, because that is possibly the most specific and most important lessons learned here, be totally transparent about uncertainty, acknowledge it, describe it, say we don't know much more often than it has been said during these 2 years, and show the process by which you hope to reduce uncertainty and tell the public how you will get there. But do not at any time sweep under the rug, hide the fact that a lot of the relevant science is still unknown. And so what you're giving the public is estimates and probabilities rather than certainties. And I think that is really a lesson that applies to many different categories of risks, and also very relevant for natural, man-made one, etc. So with that, I will conclude, and thanks a lot for your attention.